as a little extension of our Sunday school class, we're here to learn, right? Non-resistance is an action. My son he was teaching me this morning, an action. So if somebody punches me in the face, if Joseph comes and punches me in the face, non-resistance to me would just stand back and let him continue to hit. But non-resistance is an action, and it's an action, and we're supposed to respond in a Christ-like way. And I'm sure you were blessed in your class this morning, and I was as well. But it's not shooting, it's not hitting back, but it's responding also in a Christ-like way. I invite your attention to 3 John. We're going to conclude, Lord willing, with our study through John this morning. One of the themes in 3 John is walking in the truth. And if you have a good memory, you're going to say, time out, Pastor, we talked about that in 2 John, and you are correct. We did. Walking in truth. So here in 3 John, the words truth and true are mentioned 7 times, and John uses the phrase walk in truth here in verse 4, and it is to describe faithfulness to Christ. So it's describing faithfulness to Christ, who is the truth. Walking in the truth is living a faithful life for Christ. If you are walking the truth, you're living a faithful life for Christ. So hang on to that thought for a second. Consider another one. Another fact we have to think about is that we cannot walk in something that we are not familiar with. For example, people do not come to me for information on root canals and brain surgery. Why not? You know the answer. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a dentist. I can't give you any advice on that. I can't help you in that area. So I cannot walk in something that I'm not familiar with. On our spiritual side of things, if you can look at it from this side, our children are to walk. If we expect our children to walk in truth, what happens? What needs to happen? We need to teach them truth. We don't expect them, sooner or later down the road, they're going to understand truth and walk in it. It needs to be taught. So as parents, we have a number of responsibilities, and we're not going to list them all because the list is quite long. But I like to say, if I'm allowed, one of the main responsibilities in our homes is first of all, we need to establish truth. What is truth? And second of all, we need to pass it on to the next generation. I don't think John could have written verses 1, 3, and 4 if someone had not taken the time to pass truth on to Gaius, as we're going to look at here in these verses. Truth must be passed on. A few weeks ago, maybe a month or more ago, I met with a couple in Mechanicsville, Maryland. Those of you familiar with that area, south of D.C., and it is an Amish Mennonite area. And in the course of conversation, he was talking about the Amish he had contacted to come out to change his barn roof. And in the course of conversation, I said, so do you go to church? Oh, no, not regularly. Sometimes on Christmas and Easter. Okay. And then they quickly informed me, it was right at the time, the week of Lent, and they quickly informed me that, during the week of Lent, we did not eat meat. Okay, they took this Mennonite pastor, knocked him a couple notches lower, like, how does this tie in? And then they said, by the way, Ash Wednesday, we did not eat meat either. And then I was completely flattened. Like, okay, I to be honest with you, I had a loss of words that I didn't say a whole lot. And the man wasn't quite finished. He said, my mother took me to church, to the Catholic Church when, by the way, I missed a part. They said they considered themselves non-practicing Catholics. That's where it was. They didn't do what Ray's friend did and read. But this man said, when my mother took me to church till I was up until 9th or 10th grade. And then she said, I brought you this far, and from here out, you're on your own. Maybe if I go back, I would have responded different. But I did the non-resistant thing, or part of that, and I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. Church, the truth of the gospel needs to be preserved at all times, and every child of God, whether you are a parent here this morning or not, we are given the responsibility to pass the truth of the gospel on to the next generation, Two questions. First of all, are we walking in truth? And secondly, are we passing truth on to our children so that they know how to walk in truth? Many times, often we'll say how our church is a young church, a lot of children, praise the Lord. And we say we're raising our families. And at the stage of life we are in, that is truth. That's exactly what we are doing. But look at it from a different angle. We're raising our families, and at the same time, we are multiplying disciples for Jesus Christ. And these 2 points I got from Anabaptist Perspectives, a podcast I listened to, but the point was made out, we are multiplying disciples for Jesus Christ. And the second thing is, you are raising ambassadors for the Lord. So if you would say, I'm raising my family, I would say you are doing exactly that. But here, what I learned is we're also multiplying disciples and we're raising ambassadors for the Lord. Ambassador for Christ is one who is set out to work as a citizen in God's kingdom, representing truth and light in a world of deceit and darkness. So your 2-year-old sitting beside you, or your 3-year-old, you're doing your best right now just to keep them quiet and keep them sitting still, and hopefully they'll cooperate. But what you're actually doing this morning, Dad, is you're training your child to be a disciple for the Lord, and you're training your child this morning to be an ambassador, that as soon as he is a little bit older than 3, he can go out and shed light in this dark world. Let's take our responsibilities and look at it that way. Verse 4, which we didn't get to the chapter yet, but verse 4 says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. And I think that's every parent's desire, that our children are walking in truth. I believe the training process for ambassadors and for disciples begins at birth and ends at the grave. So we need to be diligent as we instill truth in the hearts of the younger generation. And as I was studying, the thought came to me, take the world, but give me Jesus. Brothers and sisters, this morning we need to pass on the truth of the gospel. I struggled a little bit with the title this morning, and finally, after a number of thoughts, I'm going to title the message this morning, Little as Much When God is in It. Little as much when God is in it. John wrote an interesting section of verses here, and as I mentioned, we were going to see the subject of walking in truth. We're also going to see an emphasis on hospitality, and then when we get close to the end, it's followed by a man's reputation. So we can take these three this morning and learn from them. The three main characters are Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius. That's basically what we're going to look at this morning. And with that, let's read just the first couple verses here. Keep in mind, again, taken from chapter 2, in the New Testament times, you had these traveling speakers, missionaries, so to speak, going from house to house, staying at different people's houses, and that's where we see the hospitality come in. And John starts out by commending Gaius for his hospitality. Verses 1 through 8. 3 John, the elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth, beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. There we have the hospitality thing, which have borne witness of thy charity for the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. Wherefore, we therefore ought to receive such, that we may be fellow helpers of the truth. Again, traveling speakers going from church to church, and they were staying with people who were in the church and also cared for, and then helped on to the next church. And John was grateful for the hospitality of his friend Gaius here. So the first point is the hospitality of Gaius, which is the verses 1 through 8, which I read. Gaius was a common name in New Testament times. the Bible tells us of three other men with the same name. There was a Gaius at Corinth in Romans 16. There was one in Macedonia in Acts 19. And there was a Gaius at Derbe in Acts 20. The Gaius that John's writing about here was likely a man of responsibility in the church because we see the visiting speakers stayed with him on a regular basis. John calls him well-beloved, one he loves in the faith, indicating that these two men, John and Gaius, were close friends. And verse 2 is like a prayer. He says, I wish above all things, so the primary thing would be that you may prosper in your health as your spiritual life prospers, indicating that there might have been a little bit of struggle with physical health here of this man. But then we get into verse 3 through the number of the verses here, and we see his reputation. What we had was somebody telling John about his own friend. Somebody went and informed him how he is doing. And John was informed that Gaius was walking in the truth. What does it mean? I had mentioned earlier that we're walking in obedience to Christ, but Gaius was spiritually healthy, and he was walking faithfully with Christ. Spiritually healthy and walking faithfully. And just stop and consider a little bit. It's not that we are going through life with the goal to impress others. That's not our point at all. But when you look at a man with a humble servant heart combined with a reputation like this man had, it's highly commendable. And not that we're supposed to compare ourselves among ourselves, but what would others write about you and I? Would they say that he is walking, that you and I are walking in the truth? I mentioned earlier that we're learning in our Sunday school class, and I'm learning as we go, hopefully continue learning as we go through this chapter, but do we have that reputation that we are walking in the truth? Gaius was a selfless servant, and his faith was proven by his actions. Selfless and a faith that's proven by what we see that he did. And John was thrilled when he heard of the testimony, and he added in verse 4, which is the verse you see on plaques sometimes, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Above all else, that my children are walking in truth. His prayer up in verse 2 was above all things. John said, above all things, I just wish that your physical health was as your spiritual health. And now I believe in verse 4, he's almost beyond words. He could hardly find words to describe when he heard this man was walking in the truth. So we're going to talk a little bit about reputation towards the end, but here, just think about the man having a vigorous walk with God. And it was found in the way that how he served his fellow Christians. So again, not that we're comparing ourselves, but do we have a vigorous walk with God? Are you spiritually healthy? Am I spiritually healthy? And if someone would write about you, beloved, and put your name in there, he or she is walking in the truth. Just think about it. Where are we at? Where are you at? Where am I at in our spiritual life? When any believer selflessly strives to prosper others who walks with God, God makes sure that his or her soul will prosper as well. Are we doing our part? A lot of what we see here is behind the scenes. Let's pause and ask the second question. First of all, the first one that we heard, again, are we walking in truth? And secondly, are we selfless servants whose faith is supported by our actions? You know, it's one thing for someone to come up to you and say, well, I have the gift of X, Y, Z. It's another thing for you and I to stand back and observe. Well, that person has a gift of, and you can fill in the blank. Are we that kind of a people? I think we're called to be obedient to God's word. That's not very profound. We know that. But we need to take note that the Bible does not teach us that we're only to act or do something if we're guaranteed to see results of our service. That's not how we're taught. So when we think of helping others, we think we need to think of doing things that are behind the scenes, not always being out in the spotlight. We are to be selfless, yes, serving faithfully, doing our part And then what? Then we allow God to be God and let him take care of the results. And that's where I come up with our title this morning, although it is a song, but I don't have plan on singing it, but little is much when God is in it. Are we willing to do the small things, the things that nobody would see, the things behind the scenes, no one even might notice? Are we willing to do that because that little is much when God is in it? When it comes to helping or serving others, maybe we prefer to serve in a big way, where many will be touched. Now, I'm not saying we have a selfish attitude, but the Bible tells us in Mark 9:41, "For whosoever shall give a cup of cold water to drink in my name, because ye belong to Christ, verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward." You mean all I have to do is just offer a cup of cold water to someone and God's going to notice? That's correct. That's what he is telling us. Little is much when God is in it. More on Gaius in verses 5 through 8. Faithfully showing hospitality to visiting speakers, he generously offered support to those who came by and helping them spread the gospel. And what we see here is a man who is willing to go the second mile. He was treating his guests as the Lord would treat them. He encouraged them on in their ministry. And John says, we see in verse 8, because of what they were doing, we ought to receive such. We ought to be fellow helpers of the truth. He also adds in verse 7 that they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. What is he saying? He means that they were not using high-pressure methods to squeeze money out of people. They were not motivated by funds, but they were just there to present the gospel. So as we try to picture visiting speakers, traveling from town to town, staying in house after house, just think of traveling evangelists in our day. They leave their family for days at a time. There is the strain of preaching a new congregation. There's the inconvenience of living out of a suitcase. There's a loneliness that comes with those who have to make new friends day after day. Then you think of the prayer and study and discipline to keep up with the schedules. It's hard work. And John's saying, in light of it all, we ought to welcome these people and help them out in any way possible. And I'd like to commend the church this morning when we have people come in and put sign-up sheets. God bless you for your hospitality. What can we learn from Gaius? Be hospitable. Help out where we can. Little is much when God is in it. Gaius is remembered as being spiritually healthy and one who walked faithfully with Christ. Try to compare that with our lives. He was a selfless servant whose faith was proven by his actions, ready and willing to lend a helping hand. We can learn a lot. I think we have learned a lot, and we are practicing what we see here. Generosity is commended. Are we trying or being like Gaius? And then the second point is the pride of Diotrephes in verses 9 and 10. John continues after the glorious report of an individual we just heard. He tells us in verse 9 and 10, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Just some strong words, negative comments, if you will, about a man who had quite a different attitude from what Gaius had, one that loves preeminence. And this word is taken from two Greek words, which together mean fond of being first, and which is the opposite of what we looked at in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter there, humility. So we went from a selfless man to a man that is full of self. And the three characteristics that stick out in this man's personality is, one, we talked about a little bit, he loved to be first. Second of all, he prated against John, or he was against him with his words. And thirdly, he exercised undue power in the church. So he was stepping out of line. Two quotes, one from Charles Spurgeon. A man who will not do well in his present place because he longs to be higher is too high and should be put lower. I thought it was interesting. Dr. David Jeremiah, the second one, the self-seeking and self-important Diothephes heads a long line of people who never learned to distinguish between the love of Christ and the love for their place in the church. What we have here in these two verses is a proud man that's trying to exalt himself, and John here is telling us exactly how to handle. Like I said, his words are quite strong, but the reason is this kind of attitude poses a serious danger in the church. This man was proud, he was power hungry, and he aggressively opposed the truth and also opposed those who were preaching truth. But he didn't stop there. He worked hard to keep anyone who might threaten his position. And he promoted selfishness in others. And I had to stop and consider as I looked at this, how John wrote this. Those who expose people like this do not tend to become very popular. If someone speaks up against an individual as such, they don't tend to become well known. But John doesn't appear to be watering down the facts. Rather, he calls the man by name and then lists the accusations against him. Verse 10, he prated against John, using unkind words, accusing words which were designed to cause injury to others. He resented the idea of having visiting speakers in the church because he wanted to be that person. He wanted to be top of the list. He didn't receive the visiting brethren, as Gaius did here, and he also forbade those who tried to the point of putting them out of the church. So brother and sister, if you take XYZ into your house to help them out, you're going to be excommunicated according to what we see here. He attempted to control people's conduct, not for their protection, but for his own ego. Those with the Diothephes disease want to be first. They greedily seek power and control. And this is not a section of verses which I enjoy talking about, but there is danger in desiring power. The only person who can have preeminence among God's people is Jesus Christ. We can see that in Colossians 1:18. So how should we respond here? Our focus as we go through life should not be on our position within the church, where am I at? But rather our participation in the work of the church to advance God's work and to bring him glory. So why am I here this morning? Why did Shane teach Sunday school this morning? So we mentioned his name of the pulpit? No. So we can advance God's kingdom and bring him glory. And that goes for every office in the church. It's not for us, it's for him. Are we doing what we do for God? Little as much when God is in it. I'm not even sure who it was this morning, but I think someone came here early this morning, turned lights on, unlocked the doors, and adjusted the temperature. I'm not sure who it was, but thank you. And he might have got here this morning and said, well, it's kind of worthless. No one's even noticing me do that. But no, God sees, God knows, God understands. Are we willing to do those small things? And when we are doing things for the honor and glory of God, it takes us back to the attitude and to the personality of Gaius. It's willing to do things for God. We serve God best when we generously employ our resources and talents he has given us to serve other people. When we use what we have been given to serve others. So yes, we're all given different gifts and various abilities, but not for selfish reasons, but we use them to serve others. And that's the main difference in the two men that we're talking about thus far. And I'm confident there's no one here this morning with this kind of attitude as we see in verses 9 and 10. What I see in verses 9 and 10 is a my way or the highway mindset, which will cause major destruction to a body of believers. So verses 9 and 10 are some red flags flying all over the place. We need to be so careful there. So what can we learn from Diotrephes? What can we learn from a man like this? And I look at this and I say, well, we need to learn from his mistakes. Do not become like this man. Do not become like this man. I had to think of 1 Timothy 6:6. But godliness with contentment is what? Is great gain. Are we content with where we are serving? Are we serving God and giving him our all? Use our talents to serve others, not to hinder the work of the church, as we see happening here. We get to verse 11, just real quickly there. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God. He that doeth evil has not seen God. How much clearer could John have written that? Brothers and sisters, this morning, follow that which is good. So basically, don't follow the example of the man we see in verses 9 and 10. Follow that which is good. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul said, be ye followers of me. But he doesn't stop there. He said, even as I also am of Christ. Follow me as I follow Christ. Follow that which is good. The third point is the reputation of Demetrius in verse 12. Demetrius had a good report of all men and the truth itself. Yea, we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. So John started out with a good example. Then he showed us a bad example. And now he closes the book, so to speak, on a positive note. And after all we looked at, he uses one verse to describe this man. Demetrius had a good report of all men. So if we would open it up and say, what does that tell us? I just wonder what we would hear. But here's a few. He was a man who loved, followed, and upheld truth. He had a good report of all men and of the truth itself. Repeat, we're not to compare ourselves among ourselves, but would someone write that about you? He had a good report, and I trust that they would. But notice the lifestyle that this man had. Diotrephes focused on himself. It was all about himself. Gaius, he focused on serving others. Demetrius had a noteworthy reputation, and it's obvious which ones John is telling us this morning that we need to follow. With one verse, we don't know a lot about Demetrius, but try to think, if I'm allowed, to think who he could have been. Who he could have been. He could have been a member of the church that Gaius attended, or he could have been one of the traveling missionaries. Maybe he was the person who carried this letter to Gaius. Or was he one of the people that Diotrephes refused to receive? He could have been the silversmith we read about in Acts 19, but now converted, because that name is used earlier. But regardless of the past, he obviously played an important role in the work of the church. What we need to think about when we see that we have one verse about this man and little is known, think about it this way. A major part of God's work is carried out by common, ordinary, almost unknown people. For example, think about the disciple Andrew. What role did he play? As far as we know, from what we're aware of, Andrew never preached a sermon. He never wrote a book. Andrew never held any special place among the disciples. Who was Andrew? Andrew was a quiet, common, ordinary laboring fisherman, and yet in God's eyes, he was just as valuable as the Apostle Paul or the other apostles. Yes, God needs men like Paul, Martin Luther, and Felix Mons. He needs men like that, but he also needs ordinary men and women like you and me to adorn the gospel. God has not called everyone to the same position. It was Andrew, that quiet disciple, who led Peter to Christ. If it had not been for the testimony of Andrew, Peter may have lived and died a cursing fisherman. But we know very little about his life except for a few things listed there. In Hebrews 11, after reciting a long list of names, what we call the heroes of faith. After a bunch of names, the writer wrote, I read, and others. So a whole mess of names, then he says, others. Had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, bonds, moreover, bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins, goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, in mountains, in dens, and caves of the earth. All these, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. And the question I have is, who were the others? They were a great host of almost unknown people. But they were faithful in their service to God, and that others will see the face of God someday soon on Resurrection Day. Many times, God uses insignificant and almost unknown people to do his work. One verse in 3 John about Demetrius. I picture this man as being a behind-the-scenes kind of guy with a good reputation. Let's continue. Remember the shepherds on their fields watching their flocks by night. Were they given names? All that we know is the shepherds. What about the lad? Don't think there's a name for him. Who brought the 2 fish to Jesus? Is he given a name? How about the town clerk who quieted the angry mob? No name that I'm aware of. What about those who were responsible for letting Paul down over the wall in a basket? Just says they left Paul down over the wall in a basket. And all these are mentioned in the Bible with little to no identification. I come back to my title, the title, Little is Much When God is in it. Today, we need behind-the-scenes workers. Those who call a friend to offer listening ear or words of encouragement. Those who are willing to sit by the bedside of the sick. Those who daily lead a life of prayer, intercession for others. There's someone here this morning that returned home last night at 11 o'clock because they needed to go take a spare key to someone in need. 2 people in need. No names mentioned. Do you have the gift of encouragement? One of the old hymns contained the words, if you cannot speak like angels, if you cannot preach like Paul. So if you cannot do that, the song goes on, you can tell of the love of Jesus, and you can say he died for all. Little is much when God is in it. Are we doing our part? The famous baseball player, Babe Ruth, said one time near the end of his life, most of the people, I quote, who have really counted in my life were not famous. Nobody ever heard of them except those who lived near them and loved them. He continues, I knew an old preacher whose hair was white and his face shone. He had a good influence on people. Babe said, I've written my name on thousands of baseballs in my lifetime, but that old preacher wrote his name on just a few simple hearts. In case you're not aware, Babe Ruth was known, as I read here, to being a big home run hitter in his day. He says, I'm listed as a famous home run hitter, yet beside that obscure preacher who was so good and so wise, I never even got to first base. Famous in the eyes of the world is one thing. What about in the eyes of God? Hebrews 11 and others. Demetrius, Gaius. Little is much when God is in it. There are many Christians whose lives are letting good impressions on the hearts of men and women and boys and girls that only eternity is going to reveal. And I hope that is you here this morning. You're letting that there, your impression on that soul. And there's a possibility that no one will ever come up to you and pat you on the back and say, good job. That's all right. God doesn't forget. And I think Demetrius was such a man. We do not have to be rich or famous or college educated to inspire others to go and live for the Lord. The important aspect is to be patient, consistent, honest, and pure. Again, are we talking about us here this morning? The church and the world that we are living in needs more people like Demetrius and Gaius, people who are willing to work behind the scenes, people who are unconcerned about who gets the credit as long as God does. It may be that God does not want you in the mission field. It could be that he does. It could be that he does not want you in the mission field, but he does want you to help someone else get there. Maybe God does not intend for you to preach a message or lead singing in the front of the congregation, but maybe God wants you to support and encourage those who do. Remember to thank Damien after church this morning. Good job, Damien, thus far. It's all the same in God's eyes. Hebrews 6:10, for God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which you have showed towards his name, in that ye minister to the saints and do minister. God will not forget our labor of love. He will not overlook the small things in life. Whatever we do to bless God's people and to further his work of the church, it's a priceless offering to him. Are we willing to work behind the scenes? Little as much when God is in it. Matthew 28:40, and the king shall answer, I think we know the story quite well. And the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. The people said, Lord, when did we do this and this and this? And this is the answer. Little as much when God is in it. I close with the last two verses. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be with thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet thy friends by name. I talked to Pastor Jim last night. He said, do not change your notes. But he said, isn't that the chapter that says, greet thy friends by name? And I said, it is, but I actually didn't even dig in and study that. But there you are. There's some homework for you if you want to. Greet thy friends by name. He said there's just some value in greeting someone by their name. So if you see someone, hello, brother or sister, there's nothing wrong with that. But you say, good afternoon, Brother Ray. That's what they're saying. Greet thy friends by name. Go in peace. The God of peace and love be with you. Reach out and help where you can. Serve faithfully, even in the small things. I always think it's so sweet, so neat to see Josh bring the water up front here. And now we look at that verse. God's not going to forget his labor. So you might say, well, nobody even saw me open that door and give my neighbor girl a cup of water. But God saw. Nobody ever saw me and fill in the blank of something so small and so insignificant. How can I help the kingdom in this way? God's watching. We're not going to do anything outside his all-seeing eye. Press on. Be the man and the woman that God has called you to be. Let's pause for prayer. Lord, we just thank you for the way you inspired John to write this chapter. And I pray, Lord, that we can be men and women that are hospitable. I pray, Lord, we could not be as the gentleman in verses 9 and 10, but we can just press on in faith. Lord, help us to remember that these small things that are done in your name, you will not forget. And not that we do have to do everything for honor and for praise and for glory and for reward, but Lord, help us just to be diligent. Also pray, Lord, that we can be diligent in passing truth on to the next generation. I pray we can be walking in the light, walking in truth, walking in love. Lord, if my reputation is black, help me, Lord. Work with me. May I confess failures and faults, and I can have a reputation that will please you. I pray that every soul here this morning, when they meet Jesus Christ on Judgment Day, they can hear him say, "Welcome home, thou good and faithful servant." Lord, be with us. Lead, direct, show us your will, your way. May we be humble, selfless servants. In your name I pray. Amen.